Let me start with you as the conservative, Will. What a day.
Yeah. On the nationwide injunction front, you're right. This basically ends the practice of nationwide injunctions in the absence of a class action lawsuit. And that's a really, really good thing because it's very hard to get a class action certified. And if you do, then if the government wins, there can't be any more suits on the topic. So it's a huge W in terms of stopping the lawfare against the administration. And on the case that you're talking about, Mahmoud v. Taylor, that's another huge win. And it's funny, I was just thinking to myself, listening to you, in a sensible society, we wouldn't be discussing whether or not parents had the right to opt out of this instruction. We would be discussing whether the people proffering this instruction should be criminally prosecuted.
Yes.
It's appalling that this is even happening. And so maybe we'll get there eventually. And an interesting Supreme Court case would whether those people might have a First Amendment defense to criminal prosecution as a result of trying to indoctrinate our children in this way.
Before I go to Dave, do you think this will be the first step in expanding the ruling eventually to just parents? Parents have a right to pull their child. You don't have to necessarily, what about free speech or ideological grounds? Does it always have to be based on religion? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Because in a sense, it's its own kind of religious doctrine, just not in the form of a religion, right? It's a kind of,
yes.
All these claims that they're making are these bizarre metaphysical claims about the nature of man and woman that have no scientific grounding. They're just as, essentially, they're bizarre metaphysical claims, honestly, that are religious in nature, except that there's no deity involved.
It's just so huge on a couple of fronts. What do you make of that claim, Dave, that back on the injunctions case, that this really has been resistance 2.0 and it was dealt a major blow today?
It's interesting, Megyn, and thanks for having me back. Good to be with Will. He's like the mild-mannered Mike Davis. And it really is, though.
Totally.
I try to remind my Democratic friends on my side of the aisle that Democrats hated nationwide injunctions as well. Remember when mifepristone, the abortion drug, was banned nationwide because one conservative judge in Texas, who was picked for that reason, issued a nationwide injunction, and people on the left were outraged by it. So this cuts both ways. It's just that this is being done during the Trump presidency. And there is a way out. You can try to get a class action, or you can try to convince the judge that a nationwide injunction is still necessary to afford complete relief. So you can still make that argument. But this was a long time coming because there's been a lot of frustrations with these nationwide injunctions. It will make it tougher, though, to stop President Trump's actions. That's true. So it's still a big win for those who are supportive of MAGA and Donald Trump. If I can just say one other thing, Megyn, a little bit off topic. You mentioned my book. Do you know that the title of my book, Fighting the Florida Shuffle, comes from you? I don't know if you realize that.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, a few years ago, I was on your show, when you had the NBC show, and you did a whole segment on the Florida Shuffle. So this title, it all comes back to Megyn Kelly. Years later, the scams within the drug treatment industry, the fraud that exists, which is enabled, unfortunately, by well-intended laws like the Affordable Care Act, it continues. And that's why I wrote this book, and it showed how we fought it here in Palm Beach County. But this title comes from a segment you did years ago.
That's a great idea. You're turning into Alan Dershowitz, finding a way to get your book reference in to any hit about it. And it was smart marketing. And I support the book and you. So good on you. Can we talk, Will, about the fight between Amy Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson who dissented, Ketanji Brown Jackson, in the nationwide injunctions case? I thought it was smart that they had Coney Barrett write the majority opinion. She hasn't written that many. She's becoming kind of, loathed by many on the right for siding with the libs. And I think it was probably no accident that Robert said, why don't you take this one and restore some of your good order, possibly with the right. And it wasn't just that she sided with the 6 conservatives to uphold Trump's right to do this, at least for now, to not be subjected to nationwide injunctions. But it's now pitted her against a very unpopular member of the Supreme Court with the right. And those two went at it. Amy Coney Barrett, in one instance, basically saying, your argument is too dumb for me to respond to. She says here, I'll read just part of it. We will not dwell on Justice Jackson's argument, which is at odds with more than 2 centuries worth of precedent, not to mention the Constitution itself. We observe only this. Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind here is that's not just a concurring opinion where one judge is expressing their anger. Six justices signed on to an opinion that treats Justice Jackson's dissent as silly and infantile. And that's not a good sign for Justice Jackson's influence on the court more broadly. You have to think that the six conservative justices found her arguments not just wrong, but kind of offensive and silly in order to put prose like that in a majority opinion of the court. So I think it's really reflective of how little respect the conservative justices have for her legal reasoning.
Yeah, there was another line where they say the principal dissent focuses on conventional legal terrain, like the Judiciary Act of 1789 in our cases on equity. Justice Jackson, however, chooses a startling line of attack that is tethered neither to those sources nor, frankly, to any doctrine whatsoever. And they go on. I mean, they just continue pummeling her in the majority opinion. Truly, if you read between the lines, you're too dumb for us to argue with. These arguments are beneath contempt, and they're so unpersuasive and sophomoric. We're just not even going to devote the time. Your thoughts on it, Dave?
Well, I've known Justice Jackson since high school. She and I did high school debate. She was the best of the. Yeah.
Were you on her team or you were against her?
Well, we went to the same summer program together, but we were on from different schools. So I was never on her team, but she was always, I must say, the best in South Florida and Florida. Everyone knew her, and she really was outstanding. And then I knew her in college, and then I knew her in law school. And so I have a lot of respect for her. I must admit, I did not focus on her dissent. I focused on the main dissent, Justice Sotomayor's dissent. So I can't speak to the language, although it is unusual for a majority to be so dismissive of a dissent. So I'll give you that. I thought it was interesting in Justice Sotomayor's defense, in her dissent, that she focused not just on the history of nationwide injunctions, but also that this was a gimmick by the Trump administration. This was a way around the fact that they knew they were going to lose on the issue of birthright citizenship. So instead, they appealed the more popular issue of the nationwide injunctions, knowing they can win on that, but they're not going to win on birthright citizenship. So essentially, she's saying this is gamesmanship. Don't let them play this game, and the Supreme Court is allowing them to do so.
And she's saying that they fell for it, whether it's gamesmanship or not. Well, it worked. It worked like a charm because the Trump administration has gotten a nationwide injunction against virtually every executive order that he issued in that first week in office when we were celebrating like it was Christmas. Bit by bit, they've been shut down, and it's just gotten out of control. And the court acknowledges this. And Dave's right. Nationwide injunctions have upset the left and thrilled the right in the past. I was one of the thrilled people when we got a nationwide injunction against Biden's changes to Title IX. And I loved that. And it was shut down by one judge for everyone across the nation. So I'm not going to be able to have that moment anymore if we get another Democrat president in. But the Supreme Court was making a valid point from John Sauer, which was, yes, this has been happening for some time in more recent history, but it's gotten out of control.
Yeah, and I don't agree with Justice Sotomayor's position that this is gamesmanship, I think, for two reasons. One, I think the administration will expect that there's going to be an attempt at a class action filed in the birthright citizenship cases. And I would be surprised if a class action wasn't certified at some point, because you have, the injury is pretty common across everybody who might be injured. The idea that your children might not be citizens because you yourself were not born in the country, or you yourself are not either a permanent resident or a legal citizen. So I don't think there's a gamesmanship in that regard. I think they're going to eventually confront, the administration knows it will eventually have to confront the constitutionality of birthright citizenship. So I don't think this is a game to get out of that. And then second, I think that it's not as simple as, this is just obviously they're going to lose. There's a lot of precedent for the idea that birthright citizenship is just a misinterpretation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I mean, the simplest empirical example of why that's probably true is that American Indians don't have birthright citizenship. They had to be granted citizenship by statute in 1924, 60 years after the passage of the 14th Amendment. And that's because everybody understood that, even though they're on American territory and subject to the sovereignty of the United States, they still had allegiance to their Indian tribes. And given that they actually, were born and reside on the territory of the United States, and so did all their parents, and yet they weren't granted birthright citizenship, the idea that it would obviously apply to the children of illegal aliens, I think, is certainly not guaranteed and certainly not obvious.
I think there's a real fight coming there, too. But it does raise an interesting issue, Dave, on what happens now, because now the plaintiffs involved in these particular cases who sued are not going to get bounced out because the babies are born to two illegals, right? The court says, in the named plaintiffs' cases, they can have the relief they're seeking. And the district court judge has to figure out exactly what that looks like. But since it doesn't apply beyond the named plaintiffs necessarily, we're not exactly sure because the Supreme Court's kicking it back down to the district court to issue like an additional ruling. What's going to happen is let's say, it's got to be a situation where both parents are illegal, right? Or like the mother gives birth to the child and the mother is here illegally, because if the father were an American citizen, it would still have American citizenship. So anyway, my point is, does every illegal couple across America now need to go file a lawsuit to try to keep their kid in the United States or able to get Social Security, papers and so on? We all get the kid's number when he's born. It's like unclear to me, based on what I read this morning, how that's all going to play out now.
Yeah, I think that this is ripe for a class action. I think that's the tack that the advocates will do. And I think that this will be tied up for the courts. So I don't think anyone's going to be deported who otherwise would be allowed to stay in the United States because of birthright citizenship. And I think the Trump administration acknowledged that it would be an uphill climb to get the Supreme Court to rule their way, because they could have sought a stay on the issue of birthright citizenship, but they didn't. They sought a stay based on the nationwide injunction issue, which tells you that I think they know themselves this is an uphill climb. So I think that where this has an impact is on all the other issues out there where there are nationwide injunctions against Trump's other actions. That's going to be a problem for those who disagree with the president's decisions there, because I don't think that there will be anyone deported under this ruling, but I do think that there will be people who may be deported based on other decisions that the president has made.
This here, another one just crossed the transom. 6-3, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a Texas law requiring users to verify their age to access porn sites. The first major test, quoting here from the Washington Post, the first major legal test of statutes in 24 states aimed at protecting young people from lewd content that has become ever easier to view. In a 6-3 ruling, the justices rejected arguments from the porn industry that the law violates the First Amendment rights of adults to access explicit content online because it required users to share identifying information that could be sold, misused, or hacked. The court's 3 liberals dissented. In dissent, Justice Alina Kagan, joined by Sotomayor and Brown Jackson, said, while it was a reasonable goal to try to protect minors from lewd material online, that should not come at the expense of the rights of adults. Will, I'm loving the Supreme Court, and these 3 libs are exposing themselves for who they are.
Yeah, it's another one of these cases where I have a hard time really understanding the dissent. I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with this case and the legal arguments, like the First Amendment arguments at stake here. But, you can't go to a store and purchase a pornographic magazine without showing ID to do so. The idea that wouldn't translate to the online environment seems kind of obviously wrong, and would defeat much of the purpose of obscenity laws if it didn't hold, because most obscenity is accessed over the internet.
It's so crazy. It's great to see. Look, I'm happy for all these rulings, but the one that I'm happiest about is on the lewd material in classrooms. This was a sensible ruling. And, I've said before, if you're a conservative justice and you're on the wrong side of Justice Alito, you've done something wrong. You need to reevaluate. This was 6-3. So good for them. 6-3, 6-3, 6-3 on all the cases that matter today. Loving what I'm seeing. Thrilled. We are days away from what has been dubbed by some the Rio Reset, what some worry could be a threat to the U.S. dollar's global dominance in over 80 years. On July 6th, BRICS nations, that's Russia, China, India, and Iran, and some more, are expected to unveil their plans to circumvent the U.S. dollar, thus cratering, its value. Some report that they've already been laying the groundwork as their central banks have been methodically divesting from the U.S. dollar and U.S. bonds in favor of gold. How can you protect your IRA or 401k from the fallout from this landmark shift? One option is to diversify with gold from Birch Gold Group. Historically, gold has been a safe haven in times of high uncertainty, which is right now. Get a free info kit on tax-sheltered gold IRAs by texting the word MK letters to 989898. July 6th could mark a monumental shift happening among nations that control 1/3 of the world's GDP. Arm yourself with information to diversify your retirement savings. Text MK to 989898 and claim your free info kit from Birch Gold. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.